Darkness filled my room as I sat on my bed watching horror stories on my Xbox One. It was like 2 a.m. and my parents had already went to sleep. I was so tied into the videos I was watching to even realize that my friend, Nate, had messaged me on his phone. I then heard the sound of my phone vibrating. I paused the video and answered the call. Nate was on the other end, and he asked me if I wanted to go camping with him in the forest tomorrow night. Considering it was the summer and I had no plans for the next day, I agreed. The next day arrived, and I told my parents I would meet up with Nate in the forest quite a ways away. They were fine with it, and so I rode my bicycle to Nate's house and knocked on his back door. He came outside almost immediately. We packed our things and headed to our campsite. Once we arrived, we set up our tent and the basic stuff. Me and Nate lit a fire and chatted about games we liked and other basic middle schooler things. When it was about 6 p.m., me and Nate were walking in the forest looking for more wood. "It's really nice out here," Nate muttered to himself. "Sure is," I replied. We were out for quite a while now, and it was starting to get dark. As we were walking, I noticed a small cabin behind the forest trees. "Nate, do you see that?" Nate looked towards the cabin. "Yeah? What about it?" "Isn't it kinda creepy?" I asked. "Nah, looks abandoned," Nate replied. An idea came into my head at that moment. I gave Nate a look of mischief as a nasty smile formed on my face. Nate already knew what I wanted and sighed, saying, "Fine, let's head to the cabin." The moon was high in the dark sky above. It was currently nighttime, and me and Nate followed the dirt path leading up to the house. I had to admit, the place was pretty creepy up close. I took a peek in one of the windows. Yup, this place hadn't been lived in for years. There was no furniture inside, instead replaced with wooden crates and broken planks. Those were the only objects I could make out. I heard the sound of Nate saying, "Anthony, take a look at this." I heard his voice coming from behind the cabin. I walked around to see Nate standing there, looking into the back door window. I looked at him and asked, "What the hell are you so scared of?" He moved aside and told me to take a look. I saw a table pressed against the door I was looking through, blocking us from entering. But what was on the table shook me. There was a wanted poster of a very dirty-looking man. Beside it were sharp tools and objects I didn't even know existed. There were pitchforks, knives, and sickles. I felt Nate tap my shoulder, so I turned around to see Nate standing next to me, pointing into the dark forest. Without saying a word, I had my gaze directed to the forest. Among the dense fog, I could make out the movement of something swaying back and forth. What I did next was one of the most foolish decisions I've ever made. It still chills me to this day. I approached the object, then realized it was hanging from the tree. As I got closer, it hit me. In front of me was a noose, tied to a tree. Below it was a chair, and I swear to gosh, I felt like I heard a voice coming from the forest. Nate crept up behind me and asked, "Anthony, what's going on here?" I looked at him silently and said, "I think we just saw the aftermath of a suicide." "Well, come on, let's get out of here," Nate said. Just then, I smelt something putrid coming from behind the tree the noose was tied to. Nate was frightened enough and took off back in the direction of our campsite. I stayed behind, still standing next to the tree. Even to this day, I don't know why, but I had an urge to look behind the tree to find out what that smell was. I pressed my hand against the side of the tree and was about to peek around it. I had almost seen what it was, when at that moment, a large branch had snapped 2 or 3 trees down. That was enough for me to forget it and run all the way back to our campsite. I was scared shitless. What was worse was that I already knew Nate had taken off without me. I ran as long as I can remember, before seeing a fire lighting up the dark forest. As I approached it, I realized Nate had started a fire in hopes of me seeing it. It was pitch black outside, starting from when we were investigating the cabin, with only a few stars up in the midnight sky above. I had finally reached the campsite, and Nate asked me what that was. I didn't reply. I was too out of breath to even speak. I then urged him to get into the tent. We both huddled inside, as it felt safer there. Nate seemed to calm down pretty quick. I, however, took longer to become calm. We couldn't leave because it was way too dark to navigate through the forest. Nate had brought a deck of cards, and so he suggested we play Go Fish to take our minds off the situation. I thought it was a splendid idea. Anything was better than what me and Nate had just experienced. I took an old lantern I had brought out of my backpack and set it in the middle of our tent, between me and Nate. I lit the lantern with Nate's lighter. The cards were laid out on the puffy tent flooring. We had played for quite a while, and at this point I was fully calmed down. I had forgotten about the situation. When it was my turn, we heard a rustling noise coming from behind the tent. It was pitch black outside, with the only source of light being the lantern from inside our tent. The rustling noise didn't sound close though. It sounded pretty distant. I bumped Nate's shoulder to get his attention. "Nate, do you hear that?" "What? No." "It's like a shuffling sort of noise." "Dude, we're in the forest and it's windy as hell. It's probably just the trees or the bushes," Nate told me. Paranoia started to kick in. I unzipped the opening of the tent and peered outside into the dark and windy forest. I saw nothing, and all I could hear was the same rustling as before. I had trusted Nate and came to the conclusion that nobody was out there. The noise was probably just some bushes being pushed around by the wind. I crawled back into the tent, and me and Nate were about to continue our card game when the rustling became way louder. Me and Nate both looked at each other, realizing the difference. The rustling grew faster and sounded as if someone or something was moving amongst the bushes behind our tent. Nate and I remained silent and listened as the noise continued. Nate opened up his mouth and was about to speak when in an instant the rustling grew closer to our tent and then stopped. Nate was concerned now, and I sat there, paranoid. Silence filled the tent as Nate just stared at me. We sat there in silence for like 7 minutes, waiting for something to happen. What happens next is something that haunts me and Nate to this very day. I turned my head to look behind my back, and my heart stopped. On the wall behind me was the silhouette of a man standing on the other end of the tent. Me and Nate both screamed at the top of our lungs, unzipped the tent, and dashed into the darkness of the forest. Me and Nate ran for what felt like half an hour, and I never looked back. We then ran into a bustling part of town with traffic. I checked my phone and realized that we were running for about 20 minutes. We were both completely out of breath when Nate said he recognized the neighborhood, and he told me his house was close. We gathered all of our leftover stamina and ran all the way back to Nate's house. We had found it and were greeted by Nate's mom. Nate had desperately asked to come in, and he told his mom everything. She immediately called the police, and Nate and I informed them of where it happened. They came back 30 minutes later and told us they had found absolutely nothing except me and Nate's tent. They found the cabin, which was confirmed to be owned by that man on the wanted poster, who was a serial killer. The man outside of our tent was still yet to be found. That was 15 years ago. Me and Nate remain friends, and the experience still haunts me mostly. We still don't know who that man was, but even to this day, I wish I had just stayed a bit longer to see who or what was lying behind that tree.